Hello, everybody. It's good to be with you again today, and we'll touch on the last portion of the book, which is about the writings of the Psalms. So we'll touch on that. This will be the last segment I do on the book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. What we'll do after this is I'm going to need a few weeks off, and I've got a vacation planned in here too. Somewhere in mid-October, I will begin to do the same thing on Thursdays, but we'll go through the book of Philippians. It'll be about a 6 week study. That'll be a good study for us as we're approaching Christmas time. So we should be done with it beginning of December, real close. So after this, mid October sometime, we will start working through Philippians. But today, I want to talk about Psalms, and I think I can get through this pretty quickly. I hope you enjoy. Before we begin, let me share you a little story. Share with you a story about how the Psalms have been misused, and so you don't do the same. You don't commit the same mistake. I've heard it a couple times from people, and I've had to pull them to the side and kind of help them to understand this a little bit better because their understanding of biblical compilation and the arrangement of books in the Bible and so forth, they just don't understand completely all that's involved. So it's the same spill, however you look at it. It's something to this effect. A person will say, the very middle of the Bible is Psalm 118. And Psalm 118 is surrounded by the shortest psalm, Psalm 117 and Psalm 119. And so Psalm 118 is incredibly special because not only is it in the middle, but it is flanked by these two, the shortest psalm and the longest psalm. And then they'll go down to verse 8 and it'll say something effect of, it's better not to trust in princes, blah, 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 but to rely on the Lord. They'll say that is the exact middle point in our Bibles. Now, I don't know if they've really done any calculations or any kind of tabulation or any kind of evaluation that would support that claim. But here's what I do know. Our English translations, our English versions of the Old Testament are arranged differently than the Hebrew Old Testament. Why we don't follow the Hebrew Old Testament, I don't understand, because the Hebrew Old Testament is what we would consider to be inspired. Now, that does not include the arrangement. However, I think that if we would have enough respect for the text, that traditionally, if the Hebrew people have ordered it this way, then we would also. But Christians don't do that. Probably a long, long time ago, because of some foolish reasoning, we ended up following the Greek layout. As they translated the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek about 200 years before Jesus, 100 years it was completed, 100 to 200 years before the birth of Jesus. The Greek translation has a different ordering. Now, that brings up a lot of other questions. My point being this, is that the Hebrew Old Testament that we work from in order to translate our Old Testament into English, it is not arranged the same way that our Old Testament is. And the Psalms in that canon, in that collection of Old Testament writings for the Hebrew people, falls towards the back or the end of the Hebrew Old Testament. So it could not be in the middle. It would be sitting in a different spot if it were arranged that way in our Bible. So no, Psalm 118 is not special in that regard. It's not special. It's not as the middle of the book or anything like that. Don't get caught up in this kind of bizarre analogies or bizarre claims about the Bible and what it has to say based on these kind of approaches. Let's put it that way. Let's be true to the text, and let's try to be as exegetical as we can be. And what I mean by that is understanding the history, understanding culture, understanding the writings, the type of writings, gathering as much information as we can. Languages are going to be important. So we have to be working in those areas and not postulate these bizarre hypotheses that really have no bearing upon the text at all. So real quick about that. Now, the Psalms. As I said, I think I can get through this pretty quickly because we've talked about poetic writing already. So a lot of this will be a refresher for you, repetitive information, I'm sure, but it is always helpful. But the Psalms themselves, they are a compiled collection. So it's not like somebody sat down and wrote Psalm 1 all the way to Psalm 150. In fact, we know just by looking at the headings, if the headings are correct, they are not considered inspired also. But a lot of these headings have different authors. Now, true, David wrote a little over half of the Psalms, about that. I mean, he wrote a large chunk of them, or he's associated with him. It could be that they were written during his reign. It doesn't necessarily mean that he has to be a musical composer, but I think he probably did some, but I don't think he did all of those. But regardless, we have many, many different authors, and these psalms were written at many, many different times. We even have one psalm that's associated with Moses. So, no way to know for sure, except traditionally we just have to go with what the tradition reports. So we can't date any of these psalms. They could fall anywhere in the history of the Old Testament where they're written at. In fact, there probably are some elements of the Psalms that a person that's a scholar in the study of the Psalms would be able to point out some Psalms that these are really, really old, ancient Psalms, where these seem to be a little bit newer, and they could do that based on the language. Now, I don't know how accurate you can be by looking at the language in Psalms. I'm sure the vocabulary usage could indicate eras of time. But when we're dealing with poetry, people tend to write in ways to be enigmatic or mysterious. So what I'm trying to say is it's possible for a person that could have been later on in the Old Testament historical period to write as if it was written earlier by using some ancient language. It's reasonable, it's possible. But again, we cannot date any of these. Some of them, though, some of these Psalms, if you know your history of the Israelites, can definitely be dated to periods of time. There's no doubt about it. Some of these Psalms that David wrote are very easily anchored into his lifetime and his experiences. Psalm 34 is just a great example. It's retelling a time when he had to act as if he were crazy or mad in order to save his life. And so that is a historical act that's written about in 1 Samuel, and then it's told poetically in Psalm 34. So we do have a lot of these that are anchored in some kind of historical situation. You may not be able to pinpoint the exact historical date or the exact historical time frame, but you can be pretty close. In this era of time, you could probably associate some of these Psalms very, very easily. The Psalms were compiled into 5 books. So there's actually a book 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the Psalms. No one knows what the criteria were for creating these. Off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure that there are not any Davidic Psalms in book 4 and book 5 of the Psalms. They all fall in book 1, 2, and 3. And book 5 closes with a large section of praise type of Psalms. So no one knows why they were compiled as they were, but it is interesting we have five partitions. And a lot of scholars surmise, and I think it's probably accurate, that is trying to follow the idea of the first 5 books of Moses. So the ancient Israelite people held these Psalms in high regard. Let's put it that way. They're trying to mirror the 5 books, or the Pentateuch, with their 5-part partition of the Psalms. So they're giving it some kind of that covenantal relevance, I guess. And if you are aware of the communicative style of many of the Psalms, there is a lot of information there about the blessings that come from being an observer of the Old Covenant dutifully, being obedient to that covenant. Blessings. There are curses too. But a lot of it goes back to the person's the way they're living in accord with the covenant or not, and what happens in their life because of that. A lot of times Psalms also are people pouring out their emotions to God, and I'll come back to this in a minute. So the Psalms communicate indirectly. They never communicate directly. Be very careful about saying something to the effect of, I read my Bible literally. And if it says literally, then this is what it's saying and this is what it means. That is not the way that we're supposed to understand the Bible. In fact, we've been going over this week by week by week by helping you to understand certain principles that are important for you to follow as you're reading through these in order to understand what the communicator is expressing through these writings. You can't really do that with many of the writings in the Bible, but the Psalms especially, they are poetry, and so they're going to communicate indirectly. Now, one of the favorite means of communication within a psalm is called parallelism. Parallelism is the idea where two lines, and sometimes even three, maybe even up to four, are working together. Usually it's only two lines. So these two lines are paralleling one another. Now there are three main types of parallelism. So you have synonymous parallelism. That would be where two lines basically say the same thing, but with different wording. So you could say, God is fair, he is beautiful, something to that effect. It's saying the same thing, but just in a different way. So the Psalms are repetitive conceptually, not necessarily repeating words, but conceptually they are. In order to imprint this image, because it is giving us images, word pictures, and to some degree, about God or the circumstances or the person or whatever's going on at that time. So, we don't read it that way because it's communicating indirectly. Now, there's also antonymous parallelism, where two lines say exactly the opposite. Now, this doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. Now, again, you do this in order to communicate in a certain way. So, you come across this parallelism, which you will automatically in Psalms. You just need to slow down and to think about what you're reading. These aren't thinking readings. These are contemplative readings. You have to read them slowly, and you have to put thought into them as you evaluate what the communicative message is. Another type of parallelism is climactic. It's similar to synonymous, but in that the second line increases the information or some degree about whatever's being said. So you could say, I don't know, God is fair. He is more gorgeous than anything. So we've said again that something's attractive about God, but then we've added this part about the no comparison. And so we've elevated that information to some degree. So they talk like this, and they do it for a reason. And you can figure this out pretty easily as you're reading through it if you read slowly and you think about what is being said. The Psalms like to use similes. Similes are a comparison. You're comparing two objects. But similes will use words like or as. And there are those words in the Hebrew language. So this is not an English interpretation of the Psalms. This is exactly what the Psalms are doing. So they often use similes. And you'll have like or as there. But they are comparisons. And they're not meant to convey an actual one-to-one correspondence, but to give some kind of a conceptual understanding to what is being said. So we could say something like, God is as a stone for me, something like that. Or we could say, God is like a shield in times of trouble, or something like that. So it's using some kind of object, shield or defense or something like that, and then it is using that to describe God. And if you understand the cultural relevance of the item or whatever is being used there, it adds something that's being said about this situation. Now, I bring this up because if it gives this comparison of God and a stone, it's not saying that God is a stone. It's not saying that at all. It's just saying God behaves in ways that the people are understanding that are valuable to stones. What you think, what would be valuable about a stone? Well, they built with stones. So foundational elements, they're critical that the stones on the foundation are cut perfectly well, hewn in a certain way, placed properly, and so forth. So it's talking about reliability, strength, stability, those kind of ideas. There's Psalms in that talk about hiding under the shadow of the wings of God and things like that. Is that saying that God has wings? No, it's not saying God has wings, but it's saying that he's trying to describe God as a protector, like a female bird, a chicken or something to that effect, that hides their young under their wings to protect them from safety. So it uses these images to convey something about God, but it's not saying that this is the way God looks, behaves accordingly, or whatever, but the concept carries forward. There are metaphors. Metaphors are a comparison also, just like similes, but they don't use the words like or as. So you could say, God, my shield, he will always be. Something like that. And instead of saying, God is as a shield, you just say, God, my shield. And so you're likening him to this shield type of thing. Again, they're just meant to express some kind of conceptual value that the author of that Psalms wants to attach to God for the communicative intent of that psalm. Types of psalms. So you have praise psalms. There are many, many praise psalms. In fact, I said earlier that I can't remember the exact how many it is, but I think it's like the last 10 to 15 psalms are basically praise psalms, but those aren't the only praise psalms within the psalms itself. There are many, many praise psalms. In fact, the early church often used this as a way to express their a way for them to honor God, and they use the psalms that way. So we have praise psalms, joyous psalms. We also have lament psalms or sadness psalms, and ironically, these are more numerous than the praise psalms, which we would think would be counterintuitive. We would think people would be more joyous about their situation with God than sad. However, what ends up happening is these lament psalms end up being people who are experiencing great difficulty and they're seeking God's help, which really teaches us a lot about our experiences too. We as humans need to seek God more, in my opinion. We think we are too resilient. We think we're too tough. We think we're too smart. We think all these things about ourselves when we're approaching problems. And there are a great number of problems that you will not be able to overcome with your own abilities. You will have to seek the Lord. And the Psalms give us great lessons about seeking the Lord. There are also imprecatory psalms. Now, these are difficult to deal with, and I have never heard anybody ever preach an imprecatory psalm. Imprecatory is the word that means where you have a great emotions of anger and frustration and disappointment rolled up, and you're asking God to do some pretty harsh things that seem abnormal. They're not ordinary. We wouldn't think that people associated with God would speak this way, but they are interesting, and I want to talk about about that in just a second. But let me give you an example of an imprecatory psalm. There are about 15 or so within the corpus of the Psalms, but Psalm 137 is an interesting one. In fact, I've got it open right here to the Psalms. I just want to read this psalm to you because it's really harsh. And I'm just going to read one line to you, one verse. But I think you'll be shocked to hear that this is in the Psalms. But here's a psalmist. Now again, this writer is going through some great difficulty. It's associated with the downfall of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile of the Jewish people. But at the very end of Psalm 137, this is what the writer says. Now again, this person is inspired by God to do this. So we have got to understand what is going on here with this psalm. But here's what he says. Blessed shall he be who takes your little ones, talking about the little ones of Babylon, their children, and dashes them against the rocks. So the psalmist is basically saying is, blessed is the person who kills the children of my enemies. Strange. And that's the way it closes. Imprecatory psalms have a lot of emotion wrapped up in them. I imagine when I read these that there's great pain in the author's heart at the moment. Something horrible has happened. And they're frustrated, they're angry, they're disappointed. There's just lots of negativity within them at that time. And you know what? When you're like that, you know where you should go? You should go to God instead of taking it out on other people. When you're angered about a situation, when you're disappointed, when you're frustrated, take it to God. The Psalms, those types of Psalms, these difficult and horrible in some degree, as we think about the imagery, these Psalms help us to understand is that God can handle our emotions. We can express our anger to God. We can even express our anger at God to God. That's what's so interesting about the Psalms. And God doesn't hold it against us. So He is more than able to handle our anger, our disappointment, and our frustration. Does that mean you don't revere God because you lash out at Him? No, not at all. What it does reveal is that you have a very close relationship with God and that you're able to express yourself as yourself at key times according to the way that you feel. And that's what I like about the Psalms. We have people hurting and they are seeking God. We have people that are happy and they're praising God. And so the Psalms are very good instructors for people about the human experience. Let me talk about the Psalms in the New Testament real quick and then kind of finish this thing up. I'm kind of going more than I wanted to. But the Psalms are very interesting to me in that they are the most cited in the New Testament. Of all the books in the Old Testament, the Psalms are the most cited. Now, you might think, well, it's the largest book in the Old Testament. No, it's not. Jeremiah is longer by a long shot. Psalms are not that long. There's a lot of them, but they're all short. Many of them are very, very short. However, these writings are cited the most in the New Testament. Now, Isaiah follows closely second, but the Psalms are quoted the most. Now, let me talk to you about some important Psalms in the New Testament real quick. I want to talk about four that kind of come up over and over within the New Testament. Psalm 16. Verse 10 specifically, you'll not let your Holy One see decay, is really, really important in Acts. In fact, Peter and Paul both use Acts 16 as the material for their first sermon that they do in Acts. So Acts chapter 2, Peter uses Psalm 16. He also uses Psalm 110. And then in Acts 13, Paul uses Psalm 16 and Psalm 2. And so they both use this to talk about the resurrection of Christ. Psalm 16. Psalm 110 is very, very important. Set at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet as a footstool. You shall be a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. That psalm. It's a really, really short psalm, but it's really, really important in the New Testament as it relates, as they are using it to speak about the kingship of Christ, his messianic kingship. And so they're using Psalm 10 in a very profound way to argue for the messianic association with Jesus. And then Psalm 2 is also, as I said, it mirrors Psalm 110. They're very, very similar. They're called royal psalms. Psalm 2 is often used also to talk about the messianic acclamation or the messianic role that Christ has. Let me put it that way. And then we have Psalm 118. A lot of people are shocked when I say Psalm 118 to them, but Psalm 118 is the one that's quoted the most in the New Testament of the Psalms. It's quoted by Jesus a couple times. It's used by Jesus once. I'm sorry. It's spoken about in Acts chapter 4. So it comes up in Acts chapter 4. It's in 1 Peter. And so Psalm 118 is really, really, specifically Psalm 118 verse 22. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And so this very mysterious line in this psalm ends up being very important in that Jesus is this stone that they're talking about. And there's much more to it because the Hebrew people are playing with the words. I'm not going to get into it right now. But the only way to understand Psalm 118, or let me put it this way. You can greater appreciate the richness of Psalm 118 if you understand the Hebrew behind it and what's going on as the Jewish people interpret this psalm with word plays to indicate a hopeful coming Messiah. Let's put it that way. And so Psalm 118 ends up being very, very important also. Traditionally, the Psalms were used, even in the Old Testament, they were used as worship in the temple. So many of them are used in that way. Christians in the New Testament seem to be doing it in a similar fashion. Now, we're not sure exactly how they're doing it. Were they doing it musically or were they just chanting? We don't know for sure, but the early church historians do tell us that the Psalms were the hymn book of the early Christian movement. So, and the Psalms, they've always been associated with emotional outpourings from God. So that's why I think they're so very, very special. And I'll be preaching through the Psalms again next year. Not all the way through. I'm going to do a 6 to 8 week series on the Psalms, somewhere around late spring, early summer. We'll be doing the Psalms again. It is one of my favorite books of the Old Testament for sure. But again, it's God's people pouring out their emotions to God, and God is there to help them through whatever's going on in that situation. All right, so that finishes us up for this book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. I hope you have enjoyed it. In fact, I would urge you to read through it again. It is very, very beneficial in the information it gives. And if you follow what they're trying to teach you and what I've shared with you, you're going to discover many more insights in the text itself. And that's what we really want. We want people to be enthusiastic about their study, and not only that, but be rewarded by using the right principles to study in order to bring out these rich treasures of information that are stored within our Bible itself. So again, as I said, I'll be taking a break until mid-October, and then in mid-October I'll start up again, and I'll announce it at church, but we'll start going through the book of Philippians. There will not be any kind of outside book you need. All you will need is your Bible, and I'll just start working through Philippians. It'll be about a 6-week study, so we'll be doing that later on. Again, thank you so much for letting me share with you on these past Thursdays, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.